There are houses that smile on the outside while rotting on the inside. Fairy tales warn us of such places: gingerbread cottages, castles with dungeons in them, basements that echo with screams. But sometimes, real life outdoes fiction. The Fritzl home in Amstein, Austria was one such place. From the streets, it looked painfully ordinary. A neat garden, a tidy facade, nothing to suggest that under its concrete skin a dungeon awaited. Inside lived Josef Fritzl, the man of the house, a man who fancied himself a provider, a patriarch, and a genius of family planning. Others would call him what he truly is, a predator with a blueprint. His wife Rosemary lived upstairs. To neighbors, she was married to a hardworking but strict husband. To her children, she was a silent background noise to their existence, always present, never protecting. And then there was Elisabeth, Joseph's daughter. She was born in 1966. She grew up under the kind of father whose rules didn't just control curfews, but entire destinies. Joseph was the architect of the house and the architect of Elisabeth's nightmares. Outsiders, Josef Fritzl was industrious. He was an engineer, an entrepreneur, and a man who prided himself on the ability to build, plan, and to control. Control was his religion. He projected authority in every room he entered. He wasn't warm, but he was convincing. Neighbors described him as strict but reliable. He could be charming when he wanted to be, but that was a dangerous quality for men like him. Charming is camouflage. Behind closed doors, Joseph's control became obsession. He was a husband, yes, but of a hollow marriage. His fixation grew, but on his own daughter. Elisabeth was one of 7 children. She had brothers and sisters who experienced Joseph's wrath, but she carried a different burden. From a young age, Joseph groomed her. He blurred lines, eroded boundaries, and instilled fear. By her teenage years, Elisabeth was already desperate for escape. She tried running away at the age of 16. The police found her and dragged her back home to her father, the very man she was trying to escape from. It's the kind of irony that tastes bitter, kind of like arsenic tea. Elisabeth's attempts to escape only reinforced Joseph's conviction. If she wanted freedom, he would take it away permanently. In the 1980s, Joseph began working on renovations to the family home. The project was ambitious. He was building a cellar. To neighbors, this was practical. Austrians valued preparedness, and a Cold War hangover made bunkers fashionable. But Joseph wasn't building storage space. He was building a prison. Over the years, he dug and reinforced and expanded. He built soundproof rooms, heavy doors, and a labyrinth only he could navigate. He wired it with electric locks and concealed it behind shelving. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing. To Joseph, it was a masterpiece to control. It took years of planning, designing, cement pouring, and secrecy. But Joseph was patient. Monsters normally are. By the mid-1980s, the dungeon was ready. Elisabeth was 18 when Joseph asked her to help him in the basement. Fathers normally ask their daughters to help them with chores. Little did she know that this would be her last time seeing sunlight for 24 years. Joseph then lured her down, overpowered her, and dragged her into a secret chamber and locked her away. Later on, Rosemary would report her daughter as missing. Joseph then told the police that Elisabeth had run away. He also forced her to write a letter stating that she had joined a religious cult and did not want to be found. The police believed him because police normally believe fathers over daughters. The case closed and Elisabeth's time underground began. Elisabeth's dungeon was not a room. It was a coffin masquerading as a living space. At first, it was 380 square feet, a hallway, a small bathroom, and a room with no windows. Later, Joseph would enlarge it, adding more space as though remodeling a prison would make it humane. There was no sunlight, no fresh air, and the walls were concrete. The doors were triple locked, the space smelled of mold, rot, and despair. Ventilation was poor, but Joseph had calculated it carefully, not for her comfort, but for her survival. Dead captives can't be controlled. In the beginning, Joseph visited often to bring food, to bring threats, and to bring himself. It's tempting to call what happened next rape, but rape feels too small of a word for what Joseph did. This wasn't a crime of lust. It was a crime of architecture. He built an entire world for the purpose of imprisoning and violating his daughter. Joseph raped Elisabeth regularly over months, over years, and over decades. Elisabeth resisted, but resistance was futile. In the dungeon, she was powerless. Joseph controlled the food, the air, and the light. He was the god of that small concrete hell. Meanwhile, life above ground had continued. Rosemary believed Joseph's story, that Elisabeth had run away and joined a cult. Joseph even received sympathy from his neighbors as the father of a runaway. He even shared Elisabeth's forged letters to prove his point. No one questioned why a runaway cult member would keep renting their home for decades. No one asked why Josef seemed to know her whereabouts. No one looked too closely. The Fritzl house smiled politely at the world. Beneath its foundations, Elisabeth lived in chains. Josef Fritzl's dungeon was not just bricks and mortar. It was a monument of control, cruelty, and blindness to those who didn't want to see. Elisabeth had tried to run once. Society dragged her back. When she vanished, her father wrote the script and everyone believed it. The world upstairs moved on. The world downstairs stopped. And Josef Fritzl finally got what he wanted: complete power over his daughter in a prison of his own design. When Elisabeth entered her father's dungeon, she was 18 years old in August of 1984. By the time she left in 2008, she was a 42-year-old mother of 7. Not by choice, but by Josef's design. Josef didn't just imprison Elisabeth, he used her as a breeding stock. Over the next 24 years, he impregnated her repeatedly, 7 times in total. Imagine a pregnancy where prenatal care is replaced with mold, stale air, and comforting sound of rats behind the walls. Elisabeth gave birth in a dungeon alone with a dirty blanket and the occasional advice from a medical book that Josef had thrown at her, as if he were handing out homework. The scream of childbirth echoed off concrete walls. Upstairs, the whole world carried on. Some babies survived, some didn't. Josef disposed of the tiny bodies like trash. He referred to them as problems. Imagine calling your grandchildren problems and treating their body like kitchen waste. Josef didn't imagine, he practiced it. The surviving children were Kirsten, Stefan, Lisa, Monica, Alexander, and Felix. Their entire existence began in captivity. For them, the basement was not prison, it was the world. Here's where Josef turned creativity into grotesque. He realized that caring for so much children in a dungeon would have become inconvenient, so he invented a new lie. Sound like someone familiar? Last video? Every so often, he would appear with a baby in a basket, claiming that Elisabeth had left the child on his doorstep. In his story, a runaway daughter who is now in a cult was leaving her babies on their doorsteps because she couldn't care for them. And Rosemary believed him. She accepted the foundlings, raised them as her own, and never questioned why this mysterious cult daughter was suddenly prolific in her doorstep deliveries. Thus, the Fritzl household became 2 households. Upstairs, 3 of Elisabeth's children lived openly with Rosemary and Josef. Downstairs, 3 more remained imprisoned with their mother. Josef divided his crimes like he divided the house. Upstairs and downstairs, visible and invisible, acceptable and monstrous. Rosemary, blissfully ignorant or willfully blind, raised Lisa, Monica, and Alexander upstairs. To neighbors, they were Josef's grandchildren. To Rosemary, they were blessings from her wayward daughter. Sometimes the police or social workers would ask questions. How convenient. How convenient. They wondered why Elisabeth's babies always showed up on her parents' doorstep. But Josef always had an explanation, delivered with his engineer confidence and authoritarian tone. He was so convincing that the system swallowed it. The upstairs children grew up in sunlight, went to school, had friends, and they were odd but functional. Meanwhile, their siblings lived in shadows, in a world lit by dim light bulbs and filled with recycled air. For the 3 children trapped below, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, life was medieval. They never saw the sky, they never felt wind, and their skin was never burned by the sun. Their playground was concrete, and their toys were whatever scraps Josef allowed. They learned to whisper because sound carried. They grew pale, malnourished, and vitamin deficient. Josef brought food, but not enough. Elisabeth, despite her nightmares, tried to create a decent life for her children. She taught them to read with old books, she improvised on lessons, and she made games out of survival. Mothers can bend laws of despair, but not break them. The children grew up believing 2 worlds existed: their basement and the occasional flicker of Josef's footsteps. He was both jailer and God. Upstairs, Josef played the role of devoted grandfather. He walked Lisa to school, posed for photographs, and to outsiders, he was strict but doting. His double life was theatrical. He could switch masks depending on which floor he stood on. Downstairs, he was a tormentor, rapist, and tyrant. He would descend into the cellar, force Elisabeth into submission, and then return upstairs to drink coffee with a Rosemary like nothing had happened. It takes a certain kind of monster to live 2 realities simultaneously, and Josef excelled at it. Some ask, how could Rosemary not know? How could a woman live above such horror without sensing it? The answer is simple. She didn't want to know. Josef was authoritarian, controlling, and cruel. Rosemary lived under his rule as much as Elisabeth did, the difference being that her prison had windows. She accepted his stories because challenging him was unthinkable. Denial is a fortress. Rosemary built hers brick by brick. Over the years, Josef made improvements to the dungeon. He expanded the chambers by 600 square feet. He installed a refrigerator, a hot plate, and even a small television. He justified these luxuries to himself as proof that he was a good provider. As if adding a microwave turns a dungeon into an apartment. The improvements were not for Elisabeth's comfort, they were for Josef's convenience. He needed her alive, compliant, producing children, and not attracting suspicion. He gave her just enough to survive, never enough to live. Elisabeth became two people, a captive stripped of freedom, dignity, and safety, and a mother raising 6 surviving children in impossible conditions. She was a teacher, a nurse, a protector, and entertainer. She shielded them from the knowledge that the man who brought them food was also the reason that they were underground. Her resilience was monstrous in itself, not because she was cruel, but because she endured cruelty without shattering. Picture this: one house, 2 families. Upstairs, children laughed in a garden. Downstairs, children coughed in the dark. Upstairs, Josef played patriarch. Downstairs, he played God. Upstairs, Rosemary cooked dinners. Downstairs, Elisabeth scraped meals together from scraps. The Fritzl home was a nestling doll of horror. Each layer concealed another, until the core was nothing but rot. By the late 1990s, Josef's nightmare had stabilized. He had a secret world in his cellar with the daughter he controlled and the children he fathered with her. He had his surface world populated by a wife who pretended not to notice and grandchildren who presented as miracles. 2 households, 1 lie. But even monsters miscalculate, and Josef Fritzl, master of control, was about to face something he hadn't planned for: biology. Because when the body starves for sunlight and air, it rebels. And when the fragile balance between 2 worlds cracks, the truth leaks out. Monsters always think they build perfect cages. They forget one thing: bodies don't play by architectural rules. They break down, they get sick, and they die. And when that happens, even the strongest logs can't keep the outside world away. For Josef Fritzl, the first crack in his concrete empire appeared in 2008 with the frail body of his daughter Kirsten. By this time, Kirsten was 19 years old. She had never seen sunlight, never walked in the open air, never heard birds except for echoes on the television. Her skin was pale, her bones brittle, and her immune system starved. She was a flower kept in the dark, wilted, fragile, and on the verge of collapse. In April of 2008, her body gave up. She fell gravely ill, collapsing in the cellar with violent seizures. Elisabeth, desperate and terrified, begged Josef for help. Josef's obsession had always been control. Illness threatened that. If Kirsten died in the dungeon, the smell of decomposition would betray him. Even Josef couldn't Febreze a corpse underground. So reluctantly, he agreed. Josef carried Kirsten out of the cellar, her unconscious body pale under the foreign touch of sunlight. For the first time in her life, she breathed open air. She didn't know it, but her illness had freed her, at least temporarily. Josef drove her to the hospital. He claimed that he found his granddaughter on his doorstep again, courtesy of his runaway daughter. It was the same light he used for decades, dusted off and delivered with his usual authority. But this time, something didn't add up. Doctors examined Kirsten. She was critically ill, suffering from multiple organ failures caused by lack of sunlight, poor diet, and decades of confinement. They couldn't make sense of her condition. She had no medical history, no school records, and no evidence of her having a normal life. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why did her body look like it had been grown in a crypt? Josef gave evasive answers. He claimed Elisabeth had left her, as always, but the doctors weren't convinced. They demanded to speak to Elisabeth directly. They wanted medical history, explanations, and something more than Josef's polished lies. For the first time in 24 years, the narrative had slipped out of Josef's hands. Back in the cellar, Elisabeth saw her chance. She had lived underground for over 2 decades, raising children in a cage, suffering rape after rape, losing years to concrete walls. She had tried once, years earlier, to carve freedom into her life. Now her daughter's illness had pried open a door. When Josef visited her, Elisabeth begged him, let her go to the hospital, speak to the doctors, and help her child. She made a bargain. Josef, calculating as ever, weighed his options. If he refused, Kirsten might die, and suspicion would bloom. If he allowed Elisabeth to appear, he could still spin a cult story. He believed his own lies had power enough to control the truth, so he agreed. On April 26, 2008, Elisabeth Fritzl saw daylight for the first time in 24 years. She walked into the hospital flanked by her father, her jailer, her rapist. The irony was exquisite. The man who had buried her alive now escorted her into the light, pretending to be her savior. The doctors were polite, but their questions were sharp. They wanted details. They wanted explanations. Elisabeth, exhausted, terrified, and still under Joseph's grip, stuck to the script. She spoke of cults, abandonment, and vague excuses. But her eyes betrayed her. Doctors noticed her demeanor, her fear, the way she glanced at Josef before speaking. They felt the tremor in her silence. They suspected more. The hospital contacted police. They wanted answers about Kirsten's background. They wanted Elisabeth questioned separately. Josef, sensing the wall closing in, grew defensive. He insisted on staying near Elisabeth, hovering like a parasite. But even parasites get swatted eventually. On April 26th, police detained Elisabeth and her father for questioning. Josef still clung to his lies, insisting Elisabeth had run away decades earlier, leaving her children in his care. It had worked before, why not now? Elisabeth was no longer a terrified teenager. She was a woman of 42, hardened by concrete walls, sharpened by decades of survival, and she had played Josef's game long enough now. For her daughter's sake, she broke the rules. After hours of questioning, Elisabeth asked for one thing: her child's safety. She wanted assurance that Kirsten would be cared for and that her other children would not be returned to Josef's control. When she believed that promise, she spoke. What she spilled out was not just testimony. It was 24 years of horror unsealed. She told them everything. How Josef had imprisoned her in 1984. How he had raped her over and over. How she had begun to give birth several times in captivity, how 3 children lived above ground and how 3 children lived underground, and how 2 babies had died, one discarded like trash. The detectives, hardened men who thought they had seen everything, were stunned into silence. Even seasoned police struggle whenever fiction turns out to be real, and nightmares prove to be architectural blueprints. Elisabeth's confession was the hammer blow that shattered Josef's lies. Josef Fritzl was arrested on April 26, 2008. The man who had started as patriarch, inventor, and master of control now sat in custody, his empire of secrets collapsing all around him. At first, he denied. Then, concerned by evidence, he admitted. He told investigators his story calmly, without remorse. He even justified it, describing how he took care of Elisabeth, how he protected her from bad influences. His language was sterile, bureaucratic, and almost proud. Monsters rarely see themselves as monsters. Josef saw himself as a genius, a planner, a savior. He forgot that saviors don't build prisons. Police descended into the cellar. What they found was worse than imagination. Cramped rooms, soundproof walls, child-sized beds, old toys, worn books, a parallel universe built of misery. The children, pale and blinking, were led into the light. For the first time, they saw sky. Some raised their hands against the sun, as though it were an attack. They had never known that the world could be so bright. The photographs of that day were haunting. Children shielding their eyes, Elisabeth clinging to them, and officers standing stunned at the edge of a man-made hell. After 24 years, the doors were unlocked. Josef Fritzl thought his empire would last forever. He thought locks and lies could outwit biology, suspicion, and time. But in the end, it wasn't the police, or neighbors, or even fate that broke him. It was his daughter's daughter collapsing in the dark. Kirsten's body, weakened by confinement, demanded daylight, and through her illness, truth escaped. For Josef, the walls had finally cracked. For Elisabeth and for her children, the world was waiting above ground, both liberating and terrifying. Freedom, after all, was stranger when you've lived your whole life in chains. When the police finally dragged Josef Fritzl into daylight, it was not just his daughter and her children who had been freed. It was the truth itself, pale, sickly, and blinking against the sun. The whole world, it seemed, had been living above the dungeon without realizing it. The trial would reveal the full architect of Josef's depravity, and if you're hoping for remorse, prepare to be disappointed. Monsters rarely regret their appetites, only getting caught. Josef was charged with a carnival of crimes. Rape, as though the world could possibly encompass 24 years of assault. Incest, a polite legal term for horrors that make even lawyers gag. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, which sounds almost quaint, like misplacing someone in a cupboard. Manslaughter by negligence. For the baby, Michael, who died in the dungeon and was incinerated like household garbage. Each charge was a word on paper. Each word represented years of Elisabeth's stolen life. In March 2009, Josef's trial began in St. Pölten, Austria. Cameras were forbidden inside, but journalists described the scene. Josef in a gray suit, his hair dyed, a grotesque attempt at youth. His eyes shifting between arrogance and blankness. He tried to cover his face with a binder, as though anonymity could protect him. Imagine spending 24 years in control of every breath your daughter takes, only to flinch at the gaze of strangers. Elisabeth, now free, attended the trial in secret at first. Hidden behind screens, she listened to the testimony about her life, about her children, and about her father's monstrosity. She wasn't hiding because she was ashamed. She was hiding because he was. Joseph's lawyers spun tales almost as absurd as the dungeon itself. They argued that Josef had been abused as a child, that he was strict, but he provided, that he built the cellar not as a prison, but as a protective space. Protective, like duct tape across the mouth protects from speaking. Like locked steel doors protect against freedom. Josef himself gave interviews before the trial where he described his crimes with chilling calm. He admitted to rape but denied cruelty. He insisted Elisabeth had a good life in the cellar. He pointed to the fridge, the hot plate, and the television, as if IKEA furniture cancels out rape. The prosecution presented video testimony from Elisabeth. She described the abduction, the rape, the births, the deaths, and described living in a concrete box for nearly a quarter of a century, raising 6 children in conditions unfit for animals. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The horror spoke for itself. The jury sat in silence. Reporters wrote that some of them even cried. Even hardened journalists felt sick. Elisabeth wasn't just telling her story. She was indicting a nation that had looked away, a community that believed Josef lies, and a system that never asked why a runaway kept sending letters for 24 years. Medical reports on the children were presented. Doctors testified about their conditions. Kirsten, nearly dead from organ failure. Stefan, who had to learn to walk upright after spending years hunched in a low-ceiling room. And Felix, who had never seen the sky until age 6. They were living evidence, breathing exhibits of Joseph's crimes. Their very bodies were testimony. After 5 days, the jury returned. The charges weren't debated for long. The evidence was overwhelming and the horror undeniable. Josef Fritzl was found guilty on all counts. His sentence, life imprisonment. He was to spend the rest of his days in a psychiatric facility, where doors would lock from the outside and freedom would never again be his. The irony is delicious. He built a prison for his daughter only to end up in one himself. The only difference is that he had windows. The world devoured the story like carrion birds. Newspapers splashed the headlines. Television anchors stammered through the details. Whole nations asked, how could this happen? How could a man imprison his daughter for 24 years in a suburban basement without anyone knowing? Austria, in particular, reeled. The country that had prided itself on order and civility was now synonymous with incest, rape, and dungeons. Politicians sputtered apologies. Social workers vowed reforms. But behind all the outrage was voyeurism. People weren't just horrified. They were fascinated. It was a fairy tale turned inside out. A gothic nightmare stitched into suburban realities. It was proof that evil doesn't wear horns. Sometimes it wears a neat suit and builds basements. Reporters from prison say that Josef aged rapidly after his conviction. His dyed hair grew out. His body sagged, and his arrogance curled into paranoia. Other inmates despised him, not out of morality. Prisoners have their own hierarchies of sin, and child abuse sits at the bottom. He lived under threat, isolated even behind bars. He filed appeals, and they were denied. No court was interested in hearing his excuses again. His empire of control was gone. His audience gone. His dungeon dismantled. Now he rots in a locked room, a poetic echo of what he inflicted on others. Elisabeth, meanwhile, began to rebuild. She and her children were placed under psychological care, hidden from the press, protected from Joseph's shadows. Slowly, painfully, they learned how to live in a world that was both larger and kinder than the one they'd known. She cut ties with her mother, Rosemary, who claimed ignorance. Perhaps Elisabeth couldn't forgive her silence, or perhaps she understood it too well. Elisabeth later found love, remarried, and built a new life of secrecy. She doesn't appear in interviews, doesn't exploit her story, and doesn't capitalize on her trauma. She vanishes from the spotlight the way true survivors do. She doesn't owe us spectacle. She owes herself peace. Josef Fritzl believed himself an architect of control. His trial revealed him instead as a coward hiding behind excuses, minimizing his crimes, terrified of judgment. Elisabeth entered the courtroom a victim and left it something else, a survivor who forced the world to look at what they didn't want to see. The dungeon had been Joseph's kingdom. In the end, it became his tomb. When Josef Fritzl's dungeon was open, it wasn't just concrete and locks that spilled into the daylight. It was 24 years of silence, 24 years of secrets, and 24 years of proof that evil can thrive behind garden edges and lace curtains. The question wasn't just, how did this happen, but how did no one see it? The answer, of course, is simple. People rarely looked for monsters in their own neighborhoods. Elisabeth and her 6 surviving children were placed in a care facility after the rescue. Doctors treated their bodies, psychologists treated their minds, and society pretended it could treat their souls. Kirsten, who nearly died, remained in intensive care for weeks. Stefan struggled to walk upright, his spine bent from years in a low-ceiling room. Felix, the youngest, was bewildered by the sky. He had lived his entire life underground and sunlight terrified him. Elisabeth, despite decades of trauma, did what she always had. She became their anchor. She shielded them from Josef in the dungeon, and now she shielded them from the world's hunger for spectacle. She and her children were relocated under new identities, far from Amsterdam. Their new home was guarded like a fortress, not against Josef, he was caged, but against the press. Journalists camped outside, desperate for photos, sound bites, and trauma packaged for consumption. Elisabeth wanted none of it. Survivors don't owe us their stories. We just act entitled to them. Rosemary, Joseph's wife, claimed ignorance. She said she never suspected the basement held her daughter and her grandchildren. Perhaps she was lying to herself. Perhaps denial is the only way she survived her marriage. But Elisabeth cut ties. After all, ignorance is not innocence. A mother who cannot see her children suffering is a mother in name only. Rosemary was left to live with silence, her husband in prison, her children estranged, and her home demolished. Josef was sentenced to life imprisonment in a psychiatric facility, which is just a polite way of saying how he lived in a dungeon, but one built by the state. Other inmates despised him. Even criminals have a hierarchy of sin, and child abuse sits at the bottom. Josef was threatened, spat on, and reportedly beaten. He was placed in isolation, not for his safety, but because the guards didn't want to clean up the aftermath. His dyed hair grew out, his body sagged, and the architect of control now shuffled down sterile hallways like a relic, no longer feared, just pitied and despised. His name became shorthand for horror. The man who thought himself a god ended his life as a ghost. The Fritzl case scarred Austria's image. A country known for Mozart, mountains, and waltzes was suddenly synonymous with basement and incest. Politicians rushed to promise reforms, social services promised vigilance, and neighbors asked each other awkward questions. What if we missed something too? Globally, the case became a grotesque obsession. Documentaries, books, and tabloid headlines. People devoured this story with the same appetite Josef once reserved for control. Outrage mixed with fascination. Horror mixed with voyeurism. The case forced societies to ask uncomfortable questions. How many other locked doors hide monsters? How many missing persons are actually imprisoned a few feet away? How far can denial stretch before it becomes complicity? The answers weren't comforting. In the years since, Elisabeth has refused to become a celebrity survivor. She does not tour talk shows. She does not sell memoirs. She rebuilt her life in secrecy, protecting her children from the shadow of their origins. She found love again, remarried, and carved out a life defined not by Joseph's dungeon, but by her own resilience. She chose silence not because she is weak, but because she is strong enough to keep her healing private. Her victory isn't that she survived. Her victory is that she denied Joseph the legacy he craved, attention. Josef Fritzl is a name that inspires disgust, but disgust is too easy. Disgust lets us keep monsters at arm's length, as if they are alien. He was an alien. He was ordinary. A man with a house, a wife, a job, and a basement. That's what makes him terrifying. Monsters don't lurk in forests. They build kitchens and mow lawns. They wave to neighbors while locking daughters underground. Elisabeth's story isn't just about survival, it's about blindness. The blindness of a mother, the blindness of a community, and the blindness of a society that prefers polite lies than ugly truths. If this story feels too dark, good. It should. Darkness reminds us that evil isn't supernatural, it's architectural, it's familial, and it's banal. Josef Fritzl wanted control. In the end, he lost it. His daughter spoke, the world heard, and his dungeon became his undoing. Elisabeth wanted freedom. In the end, she earned it. She walked into the light, carrying her children with her, and refused to be defined by the man who tried to erase her. As for Joseph, he rots in a cell, staring at walls not of his own design, a fitting symmetry. And the next time you pass a quiet house with shutter windows and a tidy lawn, remember this. Fairy tales warn us that dungeons can hide in the most ordinary places. You just have to look under the floorboards. Fun fact, this video is actually my first ever time hearing this full story about Josef Fritzl and his daughter. Honestly, it's got my mind in a very funky and fogged up headspace right now. It's got my stomach turning. It's very sick, very twisted. It's not like anything I've heard ever. Maybe I don't read enough about stuff like this, but this is one of the sickest cases I've ever heard and ever read of. This was my take on the Fritzl case, and I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. I will be doing way more true crime documentaries like this soon. If you want to stay tuned and stick around for the future videos just like this one, click that subscribe button. Don't be scared to hit the like, and don't be scared to share with some friends too. Maybe some family, you know, anybody. Brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, anyone, if you'd like to. I hope you have an amazing day, evening, or night, and I hope to see you next time.